Hosting our program this afternoon is Ambassador Terry Miller. Ambassador Miller serves Heritage as the Mark A. Kolokotronis Fellow in Economic Freedom. He is also director of our Center for International Trade and Economics. He oversees our ongoing research in the role of free markets and trade in fostering economic growth here and around the world. He also oversees the publications of Heritage's annual Index of Economic Freedom. And prior to joining Heritage, Ambassador Miller was a diplomat and public servant. Please join me in welcoming Terry Miller. Terry.
Thank you, John, and let me add my welcome to all of you here at the Heritage Foundation today. When an American individual or an American firm buys a product from someone overseas, the American sends dollars to that person overseas. And that overseas entity has really three things they can do with those dollars. They can save them, and a lot of people do, to hold a stock of value because there's so much confidence in the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar. So that's one of the things that happens. Another thing they can do is they can take those dollars and they can turn around and they can invest them in the United States, in a business here in the United States, creating jobs here for Americans, workers, to create things in the U.S. economy. And the last thing they can do is they could buy something from Americans. They could buy a good or a service from an American here in the United States. Now, all three of those things, in my view at least, are a positive for America and for the U.S. economy. We benefit in all three of those circumstances. But in two of those circumstances, when they simply hold the dollars as a stock of wealth, or when they invest the dollars back in the United States, that increases what we call the trade deficit. And in the last case, that doesn't happen if they just buy a good or a service from Americans. So we have three good things happening in the American economy. In one of those cases, we say everybody agrees that's a good thing. And in two of those cases, we say, uh-oh, the trade deficit, this bugaboo of some sort, has increased. I'll let you decide whether that's a smart way to think about the economy or the way we do business. I personally don't. But in any case, we have two very distinguished guests with us here today to talk about this very subject and to think about some ways of handling this. Frank Lavin is the chairman of the Public Affairs Practice for Edelman Asia Pacific. He served previously as the Undersecretary for International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce in the administration of George W. Bush. And prior to that, he served as our U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Singapore, where he was very actively engaged in the negotiations of the U.S.-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. Frank's done a lot of other things, but I'm going to leave it right there for his bio. Also joining us is Fredrik Erixon. He's a Swedish economist and writer. He's director of the European Center for International Political Economy. That's a world economy think tank based in Brussels that he co-founded in 2006. Both of these gentlemen are authors, co-authors with Hannah Derringer of a recent paper entitled Deepening NAFTA and Signing New Trade Agreements, a U.S. trade strategy to boost the economy and reduce the trade deficit. I hope you all had an opportunity to pick up a copy of that paper outside. They brought with them today a presentation to make on this subject, and I think we're going to have the opportunity to explore the topic of free trade agreements and trade deficits in some significant depth. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And who's going first?
I think I'm up first here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Terry. Thank you for that very gracious introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a not particularly inviting day. So it's good to see that we have the true believers in trade policy here in the room, and I'm grateful you can make it. And it's thank you to Patrick and to Heritage. I always had the chance to present here a dozen times over the years on Asia policy or trade policy, or a history presentation last time, and it's always been a great opportunity for me. It's been a terrific audience, so I'm glad to come back. And I serve on the advisory board for Walter Lohman of the Asia Studies Center, so I'm pretty heavily involved in a lot of the heritage work. Yeah, what we'd like to do is just walk through some of the high points of this paper. If you're interested, the paper's there that you can follow, and you might have noticed about a week ago, the Wall Street Journal ran a op-ed piece we wrote on looking at just one of the essays in the paper, one of the themes of the paper on free trade agreements. But it'd be great to have you. So why don't I just start the process and walk through what we're doing. I hope I've got this right. There we are. Look, this is one of the core themes, playing off of Terry's comment of a minute ago. If the trade balance is your religion, as Terry notes, it's not everybody's religion, but if that is your religion, then free trade agreements are your church. Which is to say, as opposed to a school of thought that free trade agreements are injurious or cost jobs or people don't honor them or comply with them or they're skewed or unfavorable, a lot of pejoratives thrown out free trade agreements. Our study of free trade agreements and results trade come to just the opposite conclusion, that they're beneficial to the U.S. economy, that countries are overwhelmingly compliant with them. Yes, with any liberalization, there can be dislocation and second-order effects, but there's also dislocation and second-order effects because of technology or because of changes in society or because of competitive pressure or because of changes in energy prices or any of the other kind of inputs or determinants of commercial outcomes. So the point is the world evolves and businesses need to evolve too, and some are reasonably good at it and prosper in a changing environment, and some aren't. So there's just a constant fluid dynamic in corporate activity, and what we really can't do is say trade caused this. But trade illuminates it, I believe. The meaning, if your business isn't particularly good or doesn't fit the market, and then trade makes it easier for people to compete, then you're going to have a more difficult time. But let's walk through some of these findings. This is the key summary of this. That when we talk about trade deficit in the United States, it's overwhelmingly related to our non-FTA countries. So as I just mentioned, the second point, that the FTAs help the trade balance. There's a broader point that NAFTA is so helpful to the United States economy, and the supply chains and sourcing and commercial practices across all three countries is so enormously beneficial to the U.S. economy that it effectively, in a commercial sense, becomes an integrated home market. And that leads you, that leads you to the fifth point, but there's also a particular point that's very topical that we wanted to emphasize, and that's steel, and Fredrik will be talking about that there's a particular concern in the administration about the global steel trade, where we could say that, look, whatever you might feel about steel, we all have to admit the U.S. has a surplus among the NAFTA nations in steel, so be careful about disrupting that or challenging that. So I'm not sure how easy it is to see these set of diagrams. This is our trade balance with free trade agreement countries. And what I want to draw your attention to is the far right bars. There's two clusters of 3 bars each that I call your attention to. The first, the ones right on the 3 on the end have to do with our trade balance with non-FTA nations. So you can see with the orange bar, there's a significant trade deficit with non-FTA nations. And then if you look at the 2 bars adjacent to it, that reflects U.S. exports and U.S. imports. So if we put those together, you get the orange bar. So that's what happens with the non-FTA nations. The next 3 bars to the right are the FTA partners, where you'd say they're relatively imbalanced. There's still a deficit because you can look at that orange bar, so there's still a trade balance. But there's still an imbalance or a trade deficit, you could say. But in general, the FTA partners give you far better outcomes when it comes to trade deficits than the non-FTA partners. So what we would note is that about 40% of U.S. trade takes place with FTA partners. But only about 10% of the U.S. trade deficit is with an FTA partner. So you have a real skew captured by those numbers. And this isn't surprising because the U.S. typically has a lower tariff barrier than many of the countries with which we negotiate free trade agreements with. So if we start off at, you could say, somewhat of a structural disadvantage and we negotiate what's called 0 for 0, we negotiate zero tariffs all around, not surprisingly, the U.S. benefits through these free trade agreements. So the other points we note, we can elaborate on this, the paper, the other points we noted is that FTAs play a very important role in a signal to market, especially for mid-tier companies. Mid-tier companies don't have international division, they don't have a strategic planning division, they don't have a high degree of international capability or familiarity, and so they're trying to sort through what they need to be doing internationally. And FTA says to them, you've got one less problem to worry about if you go into a free trade agreement partner country, because all you have to do is take care of your normal commercial challenges of finding customers and selling and so forth, but you don't have to worry about navigating government barriers because those have been stripped out. So we think the signal to market is very important, and what we've seen in the way companies behave is that there's a virtuous cycle that unfolds, that you have with focus on a country, you develop some familiarity. With familiarity on the country, you develop increased capability to reach sales. As you reach some sales and generate some revenue, you put more staff allocation, more advertising, other resources are allocated to the country, and that's a virtual cycle. So as sales grow, familiarity grows, revenue grows, advertising and outreach grows, and you can attain maturity in that market. So the FTA is really the beginning of a process that allows these U.S. exporters to hit their ceiling of activity in a market. I think I just touched on this. There's one additional point on this slide I want to call your attention to. I mentioned that FTA partners account for about 40% of U.S. trade, but those countries in terms of global GDP are only about 10% of global GDP. So so there's sort of two themes here. One is that FTAs are enormously helpful in improving trade and just getting the numbers up. And secondly, they're enormously helpful in a trade balance outcome for that. Then we have some interesting, just a little like, there's two countries of all the FTA partners, there's two countries where there's a significant deficit, and that's Mexico and Korea, and we offer some theories or explanations why Mexico and Korea would be the outlier. There's an important point that Fredrik has commented on, that even if there were no FTA, the U.S. would probably have a trade deficit with Mexico. So the point is the FTA doesn't capture that or make that deficit possible. I think I've talked about most of these points. There's some numbers at the end of this that we say not, so we're saying not only this virtuous cycle point comes back in the fourth tick, where we say, if we look at the time sequence of trade performance against FTA partners, so we look at the 16-year period, we see, boy, that balance improved by 30 billion. So it's you know, significant that's unfolded in that time. The other major theme about NAFTA being the U.S. home market. Well, what we see time and time again with market entry activity, what companies do, is they gravitate toward the familiar. There's a lower degree of difficulty for U.S. companies in dealing with Mexico or Canada than there is dealing with another market that might be very promising, Thailand or Poland, where there's just less familiarity, less proximity. There's more of a cultural or language gap, and it's just harder to manage or correct problems in more remote markets. So, not surprisingly, companies that are hit as they approach maturity in their home market in the U.S., they start thinking of the immediate neighbors. So we see a lot of U.S. activity in these immediately adjacent neighbors and a lot of success. And as we say, it's a new home market. The last tick there is worth spending a minute or two on, that this new home market improves U.S. export competitiveness. And the point there is a significant percentage of U.S. exports include foreign inputs. Something like 15%, is that right? Something like 15% of the value of what the U.S. exports has been imported from another nation. So these imports power and accelerate and make our exports competitive. And two of the three largest sources of those inputs are Canada and Mexico, and I think the other one is China. Right? Is that their next slide? But thank you. Aren't you glad I brought him? Good. Here we are. Here we are. You told me the truth.
I always do that.
It's a rare break, But so these are the nations that contribute the most in value to U.S. exports, right? And you can see Canada and Mexico are central to this, together constituting about 25% of the foreign value in U.S. exports come from NAFTA partners. Stay for seals. That's excellent. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Fredrik. Thank you. Thank you. We'll pick up later with questions.
Thank you, Frank, and also thanks to Ambassador Miller for hosting this event here at Heritage. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to sort of take over from Frank here and talk a little bit more about the steel sector, partly because we use the steel sector in our study as an example to what's going to happen to U.S. competitiveness if you're going to leave NAFTA. What we also did in our study was to calculate the effects if, for instance, the U.S. administration would like to slap tariffs on steel and aluminium, not just on partners in NAFTA, but also to other countries in the world that exports a lot of steel to the United States. And you've all seen in the news that the tariffs that were promulgated about 2 weeks ago, that there have already been a few notable exceptions in the sense that countries have been exempted from these tariffs. Canada and Mexico are two of the exemptions that are there. And there are perfect obvious reasons for why these two countries were exempted. The first obvious reason is, of course, that the United States has a trade surplus in steel and aluminium with Canada and Mexico. And if you operate on the point of a trade surplus, and if you start to tariff your imports from these countries, you can rest assured that they are going to respond in kind. So they're going to start to introduce tariffs on your exports there. So in this case, the effect of having tariffs on imports from countries which are countries that you have a trade surplus with is that you're probably going to wipe out that trade surplus that you have with them. So it's going to work directly to your disadvantage. If the point is that you want to use these tariffs in order to reduce competitive pressure, if you want to balance trade within a sector, in this case, it's going to have the opposite effect in the sense that you're most likely going to take away that trade surplus. So if you look, for instance, at U.S. trade in steel, we can see, as in this slide, that Canada and Mexico represent a very significant portion of U.S. steel export, while imports are much more dispersed. There are many other countries that are significant exporters of steel to the United States. This doesn't mean that the steel and aluminum tariffs themselves are going to be helpful to American competitiveness. We provide a calculation using an econometric model on the effects on output in steel-using sectors as a consequence of these steel tariffs. And we can see that if you start to work with a sort of tariff which is in the region sort of 20% in steel, it is going to have a significant effect on prices that steel-consuming industries are going to buy. And that increase in prices is going to reduce American competitiveness. So the auto industry, that is a big steel consumer, is going to be confronted with a price developments where the product's actually going to get more expensive. So they need to buy more, pay more in order to get their inputs. And when they pay more in order to get their inputs, that's also going to have an effect on the prices of cars and trucks that are being produced by American companies and American workers. The other effect with these type of tariffs is that you're not exactly sure what it is you're going to substitute with them. So the basic sort of theory behind using tariffs is, of course, that if you introduce a tariff, you're going to protect your domestic industry. So if in this case we want to put a tariff on export from the rest of the world, the simple calculation behind it is that American steel output is going to grow. That's the basic theory. But sort of everyone who's been involved in trade economics and trade policy know that that's not necessarily true. You can actually do a lot of different type of substitution. It's not necessarily the case that the auto producer in United States that now imports steel from the rest of the world, that they are going to buy steel from a local producer in America. It may be that they're going to import a different type of product from another world, rather than substituting the import they have with domestic production in the United States. So it's not absolutely clear how these effects are going to be. I mean, one thing we know from the last time we had particular steel tariffs in the United States, one thing we know, I mean, I know this because it's part of my daytime job in Europe to follow it, but when we introduce tariffs on steel in the European Union, we can see that it's not an immediate substitution effect. Yes, there will be some substitution effect. So sort of a tariffs on Chinese steel export to Europe, it will lead to sort of an increase in domestic steel production in the European Union, but only up to a margin. The rest of the thing will be substituted in different ways. So we start to import things differently. So we have seen cases in the European Union where we've put sort of anti-dumping tariffs on certain steel from China in the notion that we were going to relieve competitive pressure from steel producers for steel producers in European Union. But the only effect has been that we've started buying other forms of steel from Chinese exporters rather than to produce it domestically our own. And I think this is what we're going to find here as well with these tariffs, that already see sort of for certain type of steel slabs, etc., that the likely effect is not that the steel tariffs will lead to more production in the United States. The likely effect is that other countries are going to export something else to the United States. So one also has to be careful with sort of thinking that you can actually correct trade imbalances with the help of tariffs in that direct way. So coming back then to our last slide in this presentation before we hand over to a discussion with you. So obviously, as you would already have heard from both Frank and me, we don't think it's a good idea to collapse NAFTA or for the United States to leave NAFTA. In fact, we think it's going to be a pretty bad idea because it's going to have a detrimental effect on the U.S. economy. It's also going to have a detrimental effect on the Mexican economy, the Canadian economy, and the world economy for that matter. But the basic point that Frank talked about is that the main effect will be that prices for American producers are going to go up. And as a consequence, you will be less competitive. And less competitive means that you're going to export less to other countries. And it means that other countries are going to export more to you, because in all those sectors where you're going to reduce your competitiveness, this means that the difference between another country's competitiveness and your competitiveness will lead to more export for them. So it really is sort of shooting yourself in the foot to believe that you can achieve an increase in your own domestic competitiveness by making your own inputs much more expensive. The other thing is the effect of leaving NAFTA. Sort of if that's the only thing that's going to happen, sort of NAFTA dies. But the effect of that is basically we're going to start trade on the conditions of the World Trade Organization in between sort of Canada, United States, and Mexico. So the tariff levels that all these three countries have bound themselves to in the WHO, they are now the ones that are going to apply. It doesn't mean it's a free-for-all in the sense that you can go ahead and do whatever you want with your trade policy. It basically means that you're still bound by the conditions of trade in the World Trade Organization, unless you make the decision that you want to leave that organization as well. And here's the point. America is a more open economy than Mexico. It is also a more open economy than Canada, which means going back to trade on the terms of World Trade Organization basically means that other countries are going to raise their trade barriers more than America is going to raise trade barriers vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico. And here again, we're using the case of steel as an example. So In this table, you can see two columns. One is the MFN applied rate. MFN stands for the most favored nation, the principle in the WTO, which means sort of this is the tariff rate you apply to each and every country who are a member of the WTO. The other column is the bound rates. It's the rate that these three countries have bound themselves to in the WTO, which means that they can raise the tariff up to that level and still comply with its conditions of WTO membership. And you will see here that sort of if we would have sort of tariff escalation, in this case, in the case of steel, it would have the effect that United States could raise the tariff levels up to 0.45%, which isn't a sort of very high tariff. Canada wouldn't be able to raise their tariffs significantly either, to go up to 0.62%. It's not a, you know, you're not going to die because you have a tariff level of 0.62%. Mexico, however, have bound their rate at 34.45%, which means this is how high they can go in order to raise tariffs and still comply with the WTO conditions. And given the fact that, as for Canada, it is for Mexico, which means that when you look at their export of steel, it's also highly concentrated to the United States, which means that they can go to the bound rate in a tariff escalation race with America without hurting so many other countries outside Mexico or outside NAFTA, because they don't trade that much in steel with them. So as long as you're going to remain a member of the WTO, this is a tariff escalation race that you don't want to participate in as America, because it means you are really shooting yourself in the foot. You're going to lose your trade surplus in steel, and you're going to end up substituting the import that you have in steel right now from Canada and Mexico with steel coming from other countries. So that's the end, and we end up on the slide where we actually started, which is that we can have meaningful disagreements about the factors behind the trade balance. There are a lot of factors that define the size, the shape of the trade balance. But if you are of the conviction that you can do things in trade policy with your trade balance, and I think that is correct, if that is your conviction, you should really go for free trade agreements if you are a country like America. That's the way you're going to improve the trade balance to your advantage. Thank you very much.
I think we've got some microphones here. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. One of our panelists will recognize you, and wait for the microphone to come. If you do us the courtesy of identifying yourself by name and what affiliation you might have, and then please ask your question. Start back there in the back.
Hi, thanks. Lu Zhenhua from South China Morning Post of Hong Kong. China's newly elected Vice President Wang Shi Shen is expected to lead the nation's top diplomatic efforts to defuse the trade tensions between the U.S. and China. Given his vast experiences dealing with the U.S. During his tenure as top government officials in the financial crisis period, and your personal observation of his ability, wonder what's your comment and an assessment of his dealings with the Trump administration and his connections with the U.S. former and current officials, and how what kind of approach he could take to deal with these rising tensions. Thanks.
Maybe I'll start on that. Well, I certainly hope that the two nations can avoid any kind of trade war, trade conflict. And historically, that's tended to be the case. There's been occasional tariffs or occasional points of friction, but it's not been systemic and it's not been long-term. So I certainly hope we can stay in that spirit. But I think it requires both sides to take some steps. And I think on the American side, what's required is that the current administration identify precisely the 2 or 3 most troubling aspects of Chinese trade policy or Chinese commercial regulations that might impede U.S. Sales or investment in China, because the administration, frankly, has not always been clear on precisely what is the goal. I mean, these are modern, complicated economies, so no doubt there are many issues. So my advice to the administration is identify 2 or 3 that have the greatest economic benefit and focus, articulate your view on that. And my advice to our friends in Beijing is be prepared to address these concerns. I mean, take these points very seriously, that if there are inefficiencies or barriers or unfair practices, this is a good opportunity to correct those practices. And let me make another point. This should not be viewed in China or in the United States as one side making a concession to the other, because these barriers that might exist in China hurt the Chinese economy. They hurt Chinese consumers. They result in inefficient Chinese industries. So any chance to reduce tariffs helps China over the long run. There's maybe some adjustment activity that takes place, but this is good news for China. So my view is take that in the spirit of cooperation and find a way to address those concerns, and then I think we could avoid any kind of a trade war or tariffs.
Warren Coates, retired from the International Monetary Fund. The United States is now renegotiating NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, and it has made some demands that are not acceptable to them. What, in your opinion, are the most contentious positions the U.S. is taking, and what is your view about them?
I'm not, thank you, Warren. Look, I'm not privy to the status of these negotiations. I can tell you this from my work on NAFTA when I was in government, that what we saw at that time was not a case of any of the 3 parties being non-compliant. We thought they overwhelmingly were compliant. We had a regular study group and review process that we'd take hearings from the business community, from NGOs, from labor, if there were problems, and overwhelmingly all the participants were compliant. So meaning the challenge to NAFTA is to modernize it. Not that there's some things wrong, but so NAFTA first started with the Canadian agreement over 25 years ago, 87, thank you, 30 years ago. So the point is that was before a digital economy. So there's a lot of interesting activities taking place in all of our economies 30 years that aren't provided for NAFTA. Can we do cross-border medical treatment? And how would you allow for that? Do we have some things like cross-border education, which are widely done, but could we go farther than that? What are the regulations for driverless cars in Mexico and driverless cars in the U.S.? Because if you're going to take freight across the border, it has to be technology has to be consistent on both sides, and both countries have to have similar regulations that allow for cargo activity. Right, and we're probably only a few years away from that. So the point is, there's, I think, plenty of space for updating NAFTA. The legacy concerns had to do with issues such as government procurement, some standards issues. On the Canadian side, I know there was dairy issues, softwood lumber issues, de minimis issues involving e-commerce. So there are legitimate issues out there that have to be corrected. But in terms of the aggregate amount of trade among those parties, those were reasonably small amounts, but I cannot cite for you today what the greatest barrier is to successful resolution of these.
Thank you. Gordon Johnson, I'm a retired businessman. At one point, our exports were 40% of our business. We felt that was pretty good.
Yeah.
But it was very difficult for small businesses to export. And you haven't talked about the impact of trade regulations in reducing the hassle of exporting, which is a critical barrier for small business exporting. That's question 1, and is that significant? Second, Ambassador Miller talked about 3 options foreigners have to do with our dollars. Buy our goods or invest here or save them. Why should we worry which they do? Isn't it okay to go ahead and keep our trade deficits and have them spend their money investing here? Is a trade deficit bad, in other words? Yeah. And a third question has to do with immigration, which seems to be high on the level of our present leader's mind. In terms of the NAFTA home market, does it make a difference whether we have NAFTA has done anything to reduce the immigration from Mexico? Is free trade going to help Mexico grow and have fewer immigrants here? In other words, is there an opportunity to address the immigration resentment or whatever it is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can start off. So, I mean, you're absolutely right when it comes to trade barriers for small and medium-sized companies that sort of, like Frank started off to talk about, that, you know, they don't have big divisions internally where they can deal with the administrative hassle of trading with other countries. It can be everything from filling in customs administration's protocols, documents, which requires that you hire lawyers in order to understand what it is that you're going to do, that make sure that you fill in sort of the right parts of the documents, that you supply sort of the evidence that they need. And we know from lots of different studies that this is the main reason for why so many small and medium-sized enterprises decide not to export. Even if they have customers abroad that are willingly going to pay them good money for the products, they decide not to, because the risks and the hassles involved, just from an administrative point of view, is simply too big. So, and of course, this is what every government, I think, in the world is talking about, sort of how they're going to make life easier for small and medium-sized enterprises, how sort of the internationalization of the SME community is going to improve. But I'm seeing very little evidence of it anywhere. We're actually going in the opposite direction, where most governments in the world are making it much more difficult to practice trade and to export to other countries or imports from others. It's more and more administrative barriers that are coming up, and we can see that when we sort of quantify and measure these things, that the costs of doing trade are actually going up. So on the trade deficit, I mean, I think my point is, and I'm looking at this as a very sort of traditional market economist, which is, in the first place, the trade deficit in itself will be defined by so many other factors than the size of the trade barriers. And in this case, for America, one of the reasons for why it is running such a substantial trade deficit is because others want to invest here. So you have a capital surplus, and that capital surplus has to go somewhere. And it shows up in your current account balance, in the sense that you buy more from other countries than they buy from you, which is good news. It's I'd say sort of a vote of confidence in the American economy. It is sort of a good way for American consumers to improve their real welfare in order to get access to good imports from other countries. There are elements of the trade balance that you would like to see go away, because it's a function of economic behavior, which isn't, at least not in the long term, sustainable or productive, like, for instance, running a very large fiscal deficit. So running a large fiscal deficit tends to have an impact on the trade deficit, which isn't a good type of trade deficit, something which comes from unsustainable government behavior. The third thing I would say on factors, and you will have seen sort of politics and rhetoric going into these issues these days, when President Trump, in a speech just a few weeks ago, was complaining about Germany and German car manufacturers, how they sort of have a very substantial trade surplus in automotives with the United States, for instance. And it's true. I mean, if you go and look at a country like Germany, you're going to find that they have a substantial trade surplus. Why do they have a substantial trade surplus? Well, in the case of Germany, it is because of demography. It is because such a sizable part of that economy are people in an age where you're getting close to retirement. What do you do when you're getting close to retirement? You save. You consume less and you save more. So a country with a substantial savings rate defined by the demographic development of the country, and that also means if you save more, it's going to have an effect on your current account balance, because it basically means you're using less money of your income in order to consume and more to save. So these are the factors which I would point to sort of as broad issues for defining the trade deficit, defining the trade balance, and they are more important than trade policies, but there are elements where you can work with trade policy in order to achieve it, and I think that's what we're trying to show with this paper, which is when you have different degree of market openness in different economies, you can use free trade agreements to bring another economy to the market openness standard that you have. And when you do that, you're also going to find that the export advantages you get relative to the export advantages that the other country get is bigger.
Yeah, I've endorsed both of these points to say that if resolving regulatory barriers to sort of a fixed costs, it's almost axiomatic that larger companies can absorb that fixed cost. You know, if you're selling $100 million of product into Mexico, you don't mind if it costs a few $100,000 to figure everything out. But if your total Mexican market is $1 million, they say, yeah, but your cost before you even get to the market are a few $100,000. You say, that's really pretty prohibitive. It's going to take us 5 years of sales to sort of recoup that out of our, is it even worth it? So you're absolutely right. Now, there I think are increasingly mid-tier solutions for mid-tier companies that you can work with. For example, the express companies, FedEx and UPS, they have solutions that they'll help you navigate, meaning you don't have to pay a law firm $50,000. There's other ways to tap resources and get expertise. I know companies have gone to the target country business schools and said, we want to hire people for the summer to help us solve this. And again, that's just much easier and less expensive than, I don't need the most expensive law firm in Mexico City. I can get 1 or 2 MBA candidates to say, listen, fellas, you're our summer hires, you figure this out. So there are solutions out there that are considerably less expensive, but regardless, it's more of a barrier for the mid-tier fellows, the bigger fellows. And I also agree with Fredrik's comment on the trade deficit. Look, it's not irrelevant for evaluating where your country is, but it is irrelevant for evaluating the fairness or unfairness of your trading partner. Your trading partner could be completely fair in every respect, and you could run a trade deficit with that country. Or your trade partner could have a number of barriers or unfair or problems in their trading regime, and you could still be running a surplus with them, right? So it tells you, I would say, next to nothing about is the country behaving or not behaving. And look, we all know this in our personal life. If you go to a store and make a purchase from that store, you have a trade deficit with that store. But that means nothing about is the store, I mean, I'm assuming the store's honest, but it means nothing about did you get value for money with the purchase? Or did the store treat you fairly in the transaction? It means nothing. All it means is you wanted the product, you paid for it, and you got the product, right? And if you realize 2 weeks later you could have gotten it for less at another store or some other value, that has nothing at all to do. You were treated fairly in the course of that transaction. So I wouldn't anchor on trade deficit as a guide for successful trade negotiations. What we would say when I was U.S. Commerce Department, we would say we want it to be as easy as possible for U.S. companies to succeed in a market. And we want their success or lack of success only determined by market forces, their business acumen, do people like their product, pricing, normal business questions. We don't want a U.S. company's success or lack of success determined by a foreign country's business practices that discriminate against U.S. practices. So in other words, we're saying the level playing field, right? As long as you have every chance to succeed in this market, we in the government, we think we've done our job. Whether or not you do succeed in the market can be 100 different factors, but it's not the U.S. government's job to make you successful. So that's what we focused on, and that's indeed sort of the logic of the FTAs. We said, if you will strip out all of your trade barriers, we'll strip out all our trade barriers, and let's let countries compete for the product. So, good.
I'm David Kim with Hyundai Motor Company. 2 questions on Chorus, and this is for either or both of you. What does your crystal ball tell you in terms of where negotiations are going, and what are the prospects for a successful outcome? And secondly, if the U.S. were to withdraw from Chorus, as the President has strongly suggested, would this also be an example of shooting yourself in the foot, similar to NAFTA?
I'd say Bob, I'll tackle both. We can hear Fredrik's comments. Yeah, I think Chorus is enormously beneficial to the U.S. economy, and I think it's beneficial to the Korean economy. So withdrawal from Chorus would be self-inflicted damage to the U.S. economy. No doubt in my mind about that. On the first question, that is more conjecture. That is sort of inside. But my prediction is there's no withdrawal. There might be a basis for some adjustments. But again, my view is Korea is broadly compliant with the agreement, the requirements of Chorus, and if there is a trade deficit, it's for the reasons Fredrik articulated earlier. There's reasons why Korea might sell more to the U.S. Look, sometimes these are very simple reasons. The percentage of Koreans who speak English vastly exceeds the percentage of Americans who speak Koreans. So the familiarity and navigational skills that are required to succeed in a foreign market are disproportionately on the Korean side. So sometimes it's as simple as that. Now, there might be legitimate issues involved. Rules of origin in Korea. To what extent are Korean goods coming to the U.S. legitimately Korean goods? To what extent are they pass-through items from China, for example? To my mind, that's a fair question. But that's also a question that can be fixed. It's not a basis for abrogating a treaty. It's a basis for making formal representation, providing evidence, and asking for remediation to say, can we adjust this so Korea isn't being used by third countries to violate the spirit of this agreement? I mean, so it's a legitimate point, but it's not a basis for exiting a trade agreement. So my instinct is that Chorus remains intact, and there might be some adjustments required, but that it is of considerable value to both economies.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think there is a dimension to that negotiations which started, broadly on the same premise as the renegotiation of NAFTA, which was that the trade deficit, the goods trade deficit, in the United States in trade with South Korea had increased pretty substantially in the years immediately following the entry of the FTA, which was true. But the point is here that many other countries had exactly the same development, in the sense that their exports to South Korea didn't increase at the same pace as their import from South Korea, because the Korean economy was going through a rough patch. So demand didn't grow very quickly. The won fell and had sort of a pretty significant effect, sort of trade substitution effect, in the sense that a couple of Korean producers in sort of core sectors found that there was more demand for their products now, vis-a-vis the demand that came from sort of the Japanese competitors or the Chinese competitors. Now we've seen sort of some of that beginning to decline again, and we've seen that American exports also to Korea has picked up, especially in services, but also in manufacturing, merchandises. So in the last couple of years, we've seen a moderation in the trade deficit also in goods, combined with sort of the surplus in services growing. So in that sense, it would be to shoot yourself in the foot by taking this FTA away, because it's not going to be helpful to trade balance with South Korea. It's going to have other different sort of second-order effects as well on the U.S. economy, which you don't want to see. And I think it's obvious to a lot of people that are involved in these negotiations that the consequences for the U.S. economy would be pretty strong. And hope that sort of rationality will prevail, and that, as Frank said, there may be a few adjustments, but it doesn't mean killing the entire agreement itself.
We have just a few more minutes. I want to take you back for a minute with a question myself. You spent a lot of time in your presentation on steel. And I remember one of the slides you put up had, I think, the top 10 exporters of steel to the United States. And the country I didn't see on that list was China. And in fact, we hear a lot about how actual global problem in steel is overcapacity, most of which is being driven by China. So I gather you would not regard U.S. steel tariffs as a particularly useful remedy to that problem, but I wonder if you have some ideas about what might be a good remedy to that problem.
Well, first, Terry, I think your analysis is exactly on target. You're providing global relief to an industry on the basis of tariff hikes. That's the proposal. That tells you right there that this is not a calibrated tariff to say we're trying to go after the people who might not be playing by the rules. We're just providing relief on a global basis, and we know that most of the people in the pie chart are playing by the rules. So there's competitive pressure, and it might make companies uncomfortable. And look, this is an industry that's had a shrinking workforce since the 1950s. So it's a tough industry to get into. But that has nothing to do with trade policy. That's just the fact that cars today have something like 50% the steel that they had 20 years ago. It has to do with automation of these plants. You go to the Chaparral steel plant in Virginia, and you will literally see, this is a rather large, they're called mini mills, rather large production facility, and you'll see about 40 people at the entire steel mill, whereas a generation ago it could be 2,000 people at that same mill. I mean, it's automated, and the control deck for that steel mill looks like the inside of a jumbo jet. I mean, it's all IT run, and they say, would we hire our IT specialists? Those are our steel workers. So it's a different industry, and the economy is different. The users are different. So you've got a lot of sort of downward pressure. But I'd say in that context, we still, I think, as in the U.S. government, we'd still have to be sensitive to people who aren't playing by the rules and are violating their agreements. And I think there's considerable challenges from China because there is overcapacity, there is steel there. But there are also a lot of trade orders and trade sanctions in place. And I'd repeat my earlier comment too, Terry, that several countries lose out because of these subsidies, one of which is the receiving country because they get that downward competitive pressure, but the other of which is the producing country because they've got an inefficient, non-competitive industry that is absorbing considerable government resources. They whenever I talk to friends in China, they'll say, look, we know we have to get out of this, but it is hard, as they say, woman, 中国也有政治. We've got our politics too. You just can't go into steel mill and say, fellas, it's over. But you said at some point, though, we have to start going down that path to get all of these companies operating on a rational basis so people aren't subsidizing and it's not creating that enormous problem in the Chinese economy as well as a problem for us. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having that discussion and saying how do we work together to get the right kind of outcome that helps China and helps the U.S.
Yeah, and I mean it's a similar situation in Europe when you actually look at the trade data. There would have been a lot of potential for China to export more to Europe or to United States, but a significant part of that potential is now faced with anti-dumping tariffs and countervailing duties, which sort of trade authorities on both sides have deployed against Chinese export for a long time. So the effect we're talking about here, which we need to work with, I think, are the global market effects. It's not sort of that we have a lot of dumping coming into United States or to other countries. It's more sort of that market distortions in China is having an effect on how the global market works because it makes sort of more difficult to have sort of basic market conditions in order to do trade with other countries. I was positively surprised to see last weekend, not this weekend, but the weekend before that, when Ambassador Lighthizer was in Brussels to have discussions with Trade Commissioner in the EU and with the Japanese Trade Minister, that one of the outcomes of this meeting was a much broader palette of global market distortions measures, sort of looking at what do we do in order to deal with state distortions in economies in basic metals. What do we do with what we call sort of competitive neutrality policies in the OECD? What do we do sort of in market monitoring mechanisms, etc.? I think sort of there is a great case here for United States to work with its allies around the world in order to get sort of market conducive policies and to be much more sort of to the point about what other countries need to do. Now I think sort of all that gets distorted by the fact, at least from a European angle, that Europeans feel sort of insulted in the sense that sort of these tariffs are coming on the basis of national security concerns, that sort of NATO allies believe sort of that, you know, if you can't sort of have a proper steel trade and we're supposed to be allies, what are we then going to do? What does this sort of alliance mean?
So, in other words, the kind of issues you would propose taking are exactly those kind of issues that we deal with when we're having a discussion about a free trade agreement or other trade agreements, or indeed discussions in the World Trade Organization.
Absolutely, Terry. It's interesting to me that, as we were discussing earlier, within the NAFTA countries, you've worked through these issues about overproduction, oversupply, dumping, and so forth. So you really don't have those issues among NAFTA, and part of it is familiarity and closeness and the ability to coordinate. But you said, all right, we've got open competition, but everybody's playing by the rules of steel. That's a very strong argument for TPP. We were sort of saying anybody who wants to play by the rules is welcome to enter a free trade agreement with us. This was the Pacific Initiative, where 11 countries in the U.S. were negotiating a free trade agreement, and U.S. withdrew from that, and the other 11 went ahead. But boy, that would have been enormously helpful to U.S., would have been helpful to the U.S. steel industry. We did that because over time, everybody's got to sort of harmonize, and everybody's got to have their sort of natural market segmentation and work out what they can do, and there's just less cheating, if you will, in the FTA process.
I think there's time for one more question, perhaps back here in the back.
Thank you. Sujin Ba, Korea Economic Daily. According to Washington Post, the other day, Mr. Trump talked to his audience like this. We have the deficit in trade with South Korea, and we have a trade deficit in militarily. And what will happen? What will happen if we fail to renegotiate with FTA in the future? But as you know, there will be some very historic meeting with Mr. Trump and Kim Jong-un. And previously, Mr. Moon Jae-in will meet with Kim Jong-un. And nobody knows what kind of event will be happen, or whether Korean Peninsula go to the war situation or long unprecedented peace period. Nobody knows right now. So my question is, I wonder why in this very critical point, your President, Mr. Trump, put pressure, that kind of pressure toward South Korea. It's a very politically and geopolitically very critical moment. I can understand if this kind of a pressure can happen in the last years. End of last year or middle of last year, that can be happen. But this time is a very critical alliance between the alliance, United States, Korea, South Korea. If you have some connection, or if you correspond to anybody in the White House, what kind of a strategy he has in mind So
Right. Well, I can offer some thoughts. As you know, I'm out of government, but I can offer some comments. My first comment is I think we're very much in agreement on the importance of the security relationship. The security relationship has proven itself in some terrible conflict, and it has kept the peace in the Korean Peninsula over 65 years now. So we would regard it, most Americans regard it as considerable success and well worth investing in the friendship, investing in the relationship, and standing by Korea. And what I would disagree with is, not from you, but from other people, is any suggestion that somehow we're doing this because we're foolish or we're doing this because we don't negotiate a good treaty. I would say not at all. We're doing this because we're wise, and stability on the Korean Peninsula and standing by your friends and allies is a very important component of our foreign policy. So nobody is cheating us or tricking us or lying to us. You say it is in U.S. national interest to have important, successful alliance relationships like the U.S. Korea relationship, and that is a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the region. So, given that, why would a U.S. government official make a suggestion or a hint or say we should call this into question? I think that has a lot more to do with this person's speaking habits than a serious government proposal. I think if you talk to anybody in the U.S. security or foreign policy apparatus, you're going to get a response very similar to my response, right? And this is across the U.S. military, across the U.S. foreign policy establishment. There's enormous respect for the security relationship. There's enormous respect for, it's not just the security relationship. Look what's happened to the Korean economy over 50 years. Look what's happened to the Korean political evolution. I know you can criticize any one politician for problems, of course, but that's not the point. The point is this has moved from an authoritarian system to a multi-party system. And a multi-party system, of course, you have noise, you have inefficiencies, but you have better outcomes. You have a successful polity, and individual Koreans have much more freedom than under the old system. So there's a lot to applaud in Korea's evolution. So I would, my advice to anybody is don't overreact when you see a tweet or a comment, and give it a day or two to see what other people say. So I think tactically, I don't defend it. I don't defend it because I don't agree with that tactic. But what you're seeing tactically is this is somebody who came from an environment where being provocative or disruptive had some benefits, and maybe it did in his old business. But in the current working arrangement, you'd say actually we don't want people who are provocative or disruptive. We want to have a normal working relationship with that. But he still has the old habits, I'd say. So my analysis of this is I don't think there's any support for this view. And my advice is don't respond by overreacting and look for other signals from the U.S. government about where U.S. policy is going. Thank you. Thank you.
And I think that'll have to be the last comment. Please join me in thanking Frank Lavin and Fredrik Erixon for their comments today.